The post train is a special train that runs at night. It is pulled by both Percy and Thomas. They both run across the main line and share the branch work. Thomas takes one half of the branch lines, and Percy takes the other half. Together, the two trains get the work done in good time, and often finish by midnight. One misty evening, James arrived at Knapford Station with his last train for the day. He was looking forward to going to the sheds for the night, but the fat controller was waiting with other plans for him.
"James," he said, "you must go to Knapford Station and shunt Percy and Thomas's post trucks."
"What?" James burst out. "Why can't they shunt their own trucks?"
"They both have other trains to take before the post. Thomas has a passenger and Percy has a goods," replied the fat controller.
"Well, why can't Donald or Douglas do it?"
"Donald is helping Edward, and Douglas is taking a late-night goods train."
"What about Duck or Oliver?"
"They both have passenger trains that aren't finished until the post train needs to leave. As you can see, Duck is leaving right now."
"Couldn't the trucks be shunted by Rosie, Billy, Stanley, or one of those other extra engines?"
"Really useful engines don't argue."
James felt the fat controller was making an excuse not to give more explanations, but he had pulled the "really useful engines don't argue" card, which meant he could get nothing more out of him. But James had one more question. "Do I have to take care of my own coaches as well?"
"Of course,"
replied the fat controller. James was now thoroughly disgusted. He had to take care of his own coaches, on top of shunting for tank engines, but there was nothing he could do. So first, James placed his coaches in the carriage yard, and then set off for the short distance between Knapford and Tidmouth. He first rolled past the harbor, and then past Tidmouth sheds. He had to look in the opposite direction in order not to stop there. Then he arrived at Tidmouth Station and began shunting. It should have been an easy job, but James was very cross and bumped the trucks very hard. "Oh, oh, oh!" they cried, and some slipped their brakes on to spite James. The damp and misty weather made things even more difficult. But despite all this, James had all the trucks tidily arranged and ready by the time Percy and Thomas arrived. "Thank you, James," they called and set off. Thomas towards Duck's branch, and Percy towards the main line. Now that the job was over, and Percy and Thomas had been grateful, James felt better, and went back to Tidmouth sheds. But what none of them realized was that Percy had left his brake van behind. James' rough treatment with the shunting had caused the coupling to break. Percy noticed as he pulled into Knapford Station that he had a harder time stopping, but thought his driver was being careless. He had a different driver for his night shift. The workmen who were in charge of loading and unloading his trucks were hit entertainment-based and thought it was normal for there to be no brake van, so they made no mention of it. And this must have been the case for many of the stations, for Percy went all the way up and down Thomas's branch and never realized the problem. At last, when Percy pulled into Wellsworth Station, a workman pointed out the problem.
"Forgive me if I'm wrong, but shouldn't there be a brake van?" he asked.
"So that's why I've been having trouble stopping," Percy said. Unfortunately, there were no brake vans at Wellsworth, but there was one at Marin. But Gordon's Hill lay between Wellsworth and Marin. "We've made it this far," said the driver. "We should be all right."
So they set off. However, they had forgotten how misty the weather was, and they had reckoned without the mail trucks. The trucks were still cross with James for bumping them. They decided to take their anger out on Percy. Taking advantage of the whole situation, the weather, the lack of brake van, and the hill. As they went up the hill, the trucks held back with all their might, giving Percy a lot of trouble. At last, Percy was almost at the top. But then, as there always is, there was trouble. The last mail truck's coupling broke, and it rolled down the hill. Percy felt a jerk, but before he could ask the driver, he found another problem. The sudden decrease in weight caused him to shoot forward slightly and reach the top quicker than he thought. And before he could stop, the truck now pushed him, and they rushed down the hill with their speed rapidly increasing. On, yelled the trucks in their classic way. Percy tried his hardest to stop, but it was useless with the surging trucks, misty weather, and no brake van. "We'll be all right if the line is clear," the driver said as they approached Marin Station. But the signalman at Marin, like the workman, was hit entertainment-based and thought the best way to stop the train was to divert them onto a siding. "Oh no!" cried Percy. His driver and fireman jumped clear, and Percy shut his eyes. He hit the buffers with a crash. "Ouch!" cried Percy. His front was damaged, the buffers were destroyed, and Percy was off the rails. "Well," he sighed, "at least I'm not covered in red paint like what happened to Douglas." Meanwhile, at Wellsworth Station, Thomas had arrived and been told about Percy's accident. "It's a good thing I'm headed towards Brendam instead of Marin," he said. "I feel bad for Percy, though." However, at the junction where the line divides to go either to Brendam or Marin, there was trouble again. Percy's runaway post truck had stopped right on the points. However, because of the darkness and mist, the signalman there did not realize the truck was there until he set the points. He could faintly see the truck from inside and got out to get a closer look. He realized the truck was on the track and quickly rushed back into the box and set the signal to danger. Thomas saw the signal change. "Whoa, Thomas!" the driver called as he set the brakes, but it was too late. Fortunately, Thomas had been going much slower than Percy had, and there was no major damage, unlike Percy. But because the truck had been on the points, it had derailed, and so had Thomas. Now both post trains were derailed and stuck on the opposite ends of Gordon's Hill. The breakdown train was in the yards at Tidmouth Sheds, so they decided to find an engine there, and chose James. James was not happy at all about getting up again until he heard about the accidents. "Bust my buffers," he said. "Those accidents must have been my fault. They may have not happened if I hadn't been so rough with the trucks." So James willingly went to help. First, they placed Thomas and the truck back on the rails. Then they put Percy back on the rails. Percy was too damaged to continue pulling his train. "I can take the train for him," offered James.
So it was arranged. James took Percy's train, now with a brake van at the end. One of the Scottish twins would come by later to take Percy and the breakdown train back to the sheds. The post trains went without any delays, and actually made up some of the lost time. When James got back to Tidmouth Sheds, he spoke to Percy and Thomas. "I'm sorry I caused you two so much trouble, especially you, Percy. I'm going to volunteer to take the post while you're being mended." "Thank you, James," said Percy. "I must say," James went on, "I would much rather take your post than Henry's kipper. At least mailbags don't smell."